So I'm going to talk through housing measures, in particular focusing on a couple of relatively substantive measures that were announced yesterday. The first relating to efforts to build more homes, and the second a cut to stamp duty for first-time buyers. Now, by brief way of context, I guess if I had to choose one graph, as indeed I have had to choose one graph to set the scene, this is a pretty strong contender for the kind of problems that the government has in mind here in this area. This is showing the plummeting rate of home ownership amongst young adults across successive generations. You can see that at age 25, the home ownership rate has actually more than halved over the past 20 years or so, and similarly dramatic decreases at age 30, related, of course, in large part to very high house prices by historical standards. So that's one high-level summary of the kind of problem that the government has in mind here. And the first set of measures that I want to talk about relating to efforts to address this are a set of things that are announced with the aim of increasing of house building that we're doing, specifically aiming to increase the housing stock in England by £300,000 per year by the mid-2020s. So how big a number is 300,000? First of all, in some historical context, this gives you some idea. So the green line shows a series we have going back a long way, all the way back through the post-war period, of the number of new build homes over time. The purple line's a little bit different. It also includes things like conversions of existing properties into residential homes. And that purple line is what the government's target actually relates to. So if I mark on the 300,000 target there, you can see, get some sense of scale for how big the increase would have to be from where we are now. And you can see that this looks really like a high target relative to most levels of house building we've been used to doing since the post-war period, even though we seem to have lost the horizontal axis labels, but they go from 1946 to the present, in case you're wondering. Sorry about that. Don't know what's happened there. Now, another thing worth saying here is that in periods where we were building at levels that look remotely comparable to the kind of levels that are now being targeted, a lot of that was coming directly from building by the public sector, which, for the most part, we don't have at the moment. So that's some kind of historical context. What about context thinking about the present and the future? One way of getting some handle on that is what I'll show you here, which is to think about the number of adults relative to the number of homes. I'm going to do that since the year 2000, indexed to their levels in 2000. This is growth in the adult population, including, under the dashed lines, projections, actually all the way out to 2040. This is the same idea, but showing you outturns and projections for the number of houses, for the dwelling stock. First of all, under an illustrative assumption that what would have happened if we had continued forevermore to build the same number of houses as we're currently building, which is about 200,000 a year. So you can see, actually, even under this scenario, how the number of houses would have been set to rise slightly more than the number of adults. If we instead use a scenario based on yesterday's announcement, which assumes that they meet that target and then continue building at that rate thereafter, you can see actually that's even more the case. There would be the growth in houses would be clearly more than the growth in the population. Now, there are several reasons why this doesn't mean we don't need these extra houses, of course. For the perhaps most obvious point is that there is a pretty broad consensus that we don't have enough houses, so we need some period of catch-up if that's true. It also may well be the case that actually demand for housing grows faster than the growth in the adult population. Certainly there have been periods in our history where that's been the case because of demographic changes like more single adult households. So that's also entirely possible. Of course, stepping back a little bit, another factor that might push up the number of houses that we need is if the houses aren't being built in the right place, or for some other reason they're not being allocated as efficiently as they could be. That's a broader point I'll come back to as I conclude, because there are some other areas of policy that aren't helping in that respect. So that's just a little bit of context to give you some idea of how big a number 300,000 is. What are they actually proposing to do to meet that target? There's a suite of measures. There's a large number of individual things listed in the budget document. I've tried to summarise these in three broad groups. There's one set of things that you can think of as essentially leaning on councils and developers to both grant more planning permissions and then to actually convert them into housing. There's another set of measures I've summarised as grants, for example, for housing-related infrastructure like roads. And there's also a set of measures that are around trying to ease credit constraints for both public and private developers. So one thing this isn't is it's not a direct government house building program. These are measures that are really emphasising essentially different ways of trying to facilitate more building by other people for the most part. It's impossible to say with confidence how many houses this will deliver, in part because there's quite a lot of references to kind of reviewing and consulting still in these measures. But even if there wasn't, frankly, the nature of this is that it's really impossible to say. The way the OBR put it is, for example, that looking at measures that have already been put in place in recent years, we don't really know with any confidence what effect they've had. And at this point, the OBR have built in no increase in housing supply to their forecast as a result of these policies. They say they will reassess as policies are delivered, which seems a relatively sensible approach, but it underlines we really don't know how deliverable this is, I think it's fair to say. It's a set of measures that it looks like someone in government has sat down and tried to think fairly systematically about what might be constraining house building, but how putting a number on how many more houses will be built is very hard. Well, what about the question of, so let's say the target was hit, would this increase home ownership among young adults, which at the very least is clearly a key part of what the government is trying to do? Well, not necessarily. Certainly not all additional homes should be assumed to translate easily into more young homeowners, rather than, for example, being brought as second homes or buy-to-let homes. There is a potential caveat to that, which is that actually if these policies and the target, either now or eventually, lead expected future house price growth to be lower, so that obviously depends a lot on how credible these are seen, then they would reduce the relative appeal of housing that is done largely or purely as an investment. So that could help to tilt the market a little bit in favour of young first-time buyers as opposed to people like buy-to-letters and people buying second homes as well. But there could well be another role here if you really want to try to increase home ownership among young adults for other kinds of attempts to tilt the playing field in their favour if the concern is really this distributional one about that group being disadvantaged in the market in some way. And that leads on really to the other measure that I'm going to talk about, which is around cutting stamp duty for first-time buyers. So the context for this is the current schedule of stamp duty, kicking in at 125 when you buy a house for £125,000, and of course rising at higher purchase prices. Now, what the government announced yesterday is a new schedule for first-time buyers specifically. What this basically means is that if you buy a house between £125,000 and £500,000 a year, as a first-time buyer, then you would pay less stamp duty will be payable on that, a maximum gain of £5,000 per year. Unfortunately, you can see that at the £500,000 threshold, the precise way they've designed this means that there's a jump up, a cliff edge, which means that suddenly a £1 increase in the sales price can mean £5,000 more stamp duty. A pretty reliable rule of thumb is that cliff edges are never sensible features of tax systems, and actually we only recently got rid of a whole series of substantial cliff edges in the stamp duty system. So it's a shame that the government has felt the need to reintroduce one so quickly. Nevertheless, the broader picture here is that this is a cut to stamp duty for a number of first-time buyers. Sense of scale, it will affect, given the distribution of sale prices for first-time buyers at the moment, probably around 60% of them. And in total, there are around just over 300,000 first-time buyers per year at the moment. And as a result of all this, the government thinks this will cost it around £700 million per year in the long run. £700 sense of scale again, that's relative. That would take the total stamp duty take to around £16 billion a year. So it's a relatively small amount of overall stamp duty, in large part because much of that comes from the very top end, much more expensive properties. Okay, so that's what they're doing. Now, when thinking about the effects of this on first-time buyers and indeed other groups, really the first thing you need to think through is what effect it will have on house prices. Broadly, it will increase house prices, and especially in parts of the market that have more first-time buyers in them. The logic is a fairly standard kind of increase in demand, higher price type logic. Lower stamp duty makes it less expensive in total to purchase a house at a given price. So that's going to mean more people are willing to pay that price, and that will tend to push prices up. Oh, goodness me, sorry about the animation here. Now, in terms of the size of this effect on house prices, here's what the OBR say. They think that the cut to stamp duty will actually feed through into house prices 2 for 1, which means that house prices can rise by more than stamp duty falls for first-time buyers. And that would increase the average house price across the whole economy by 0.3%. Now, to understand how you can get numbers like that, why it's not completely crazy, for example, you can have a ratio of more than 1 for 1, 2 things I would point out. One is there's a capitalization effect when you change stamp duty, assuming it's a permanent change as this is. Most properties will change hands multiple times in their life, and all expected future stamp duty should be priced in. And secondly, there's quite an important potential leverage effect here. If I pay £1 less in stamp duty, that means I've got £1 more available to put down as a deposit. That might mean I can obtain a larger mortgage. And so actually the price that the house price that I can afford to pay right now, to secure right now, could increase by well over £1. It could easily be £5 or £6 for every pound. So translating that into thinking through the winners and losers from the policy, I think the first thing I want to say, and I've seen a little bit of confusion about this already, is that many first-time buyers can gain even if house prices rise by more than their stamp duty falls. The way I would put this is that housing is an asset. So if it's more expensive to buy it, it's also more valuable to hold it and more lucrative to sell it. So as long as you're paying what is the current market price for a house, that doesn't affect your balance sheet, regardless of what the price is. What you do get, clearly, is that if you're paying less stamp duty in the process, that's benefiting you. There's also an effect that will lead to some further gains through the fact that there will be some housing not otherwise in reach, which will become in reach because the larger available deposits secure bigger mortgages. That's not going to be the majority of the gains here. For example, the OBR estimate around 3,500 extra first-time buyers per year as a result of the policy, but that will be an effect. That said, some first-time buyers could lose from this policy, in particular if they can't secure extra credit to cover the higher prices, then they can't buy housing that they would otherwise have bought. And this is likely to be the case in cases where it's not the deposit that is constraining what they're able to borrow, it's something else, most obviously their earnings level. So some first-time buyers could indeed lose. For existing homeowners, obviously this is a rise in house prices, so they will tend to gain, although it is possible to lose if you want to downsize, for reasons I'm happy to explain, if you like. I think I will end here actually just by noting that there's a large group of young people, of course, who would have been renting with or without this policy, particularly amongst those on more modest incomes, and they're not going to be directly affected, of course. So there's a pretty large group of young adults who clearly aren't the focus of this particular policy. So to wrap some of that up, I guess I would start by saying I think it's pretty uncontroversial there's a problem in the housing market of some kind, and it is seriously disadvantaging young generations. And that key to addressing that is going to be measures that manage to increase the supply of housing. The new targets are genuinely quite ambitious. What's much less clear, unfortunately, but kind of inevitably, is whether they can be delivered. The stamp duty cut for first-time buyers will probably overall tilt the playing field in the housing market more in their favour, but there will be some losers from this as well, including amongst some first-time buyers potentially. And as I just mentioned, of course, remember, lots of young people will still not buy a house, and so they will not be helped by that particular policy. I guess zooming out a little bit to a bigger picture, I would remind you that there are also broader problems in the housing market, for example, not just about the number of houses, but with the way that housing is allocated, that stem in part from other housing policies, in particular the way we tax it. So, for example, council tax. The structure of council tax encourages people to live in bigger houses than they otherwise would. And stamp duty, I've mentioned a particular change to stamp duty, but stamp duty in general is a strong contender for the most damaging tax that we have because it discourages transactions as a transaction tax, and that stops people reallocating housing when their needs change, for example, by downsizing and making room for other people who need that extra room more, for example. So there are plenty of other problems here that are well worth sorting out that we didn't really hear anything about yesterday. So I'll leave it there and pass over to Tom.